Well, welcome back after lunch. So hopefully we can keep you awake for the next hour and a half or so. My name is Tania Bubela. I'm a professor and dean of health sciences at Simon Fraser University, and I have started my life in the life sciences, and then I went over to the dark side and became a lawyer. And so I've been a law professor in a school of public health for most of my career, and now I'm a law professor in a faculty of health sciences, which my faculty tells me is distinct from a school of public health. So I'm going with that. All right. So I'm just going to very quickly introduce the other panelists for the day. We're going to just maybe take one question after each talk, and then we're going to have a panel discussion after where you can pry us all with questions. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Harriet Tier, who's the Deputy Director of the Center for Health Law and Emerging Technologies at Oxford University. And she has been involved in developing the concept of dynamic consent, which obviously is very applicable to AIR data. She's originally trained in chemistry and has a background in science policy, so she tries to bring this cross-disciplinary perspective to her work, and I'm really looking forward to what she has to say about dynamic consent. And then it's my great pleasure to thank Namaste Marsden for coming out from Vancouver too. So Namaste, like me, keeps it a hidden secret that she is also a lawyer. But Namaste is Gitsan from Gitan Yo Ganada Frog Clan and the House of Gamlaxyalt. I'm good. Okay, right. I was practicing over lunch. She's currently the manager of research and knowledge exchange at the First Nations Health Authority. And the First Nations Health Authority is a really exciting organization. It's the first province-wide health authority of its kind in Canada. It's responsible for planning, management, service delivery, and funding of health programs in partnership with First Nations communities in BC. And I was just telling Namaste that I was doing some Google searching and found a little factoid about her First Nation in northern British Columbia. It covers 35,016 square kilometers of land, which is 1.5 times the size of Tuscany. Just for, I needed to share some data. So Namaste has over 20 years of professional and volunteer experience in developing and managing Indigenous health programs, funding opportunities and research projects at community, provincial, and national levels in Canada. Prior to joining FNHA, she was the Executive Director of the Aboriginal Health Research Network Secretariat and Managing Editor of the International Journal of Indigenous Health based at the University of Victoria. And she has 2 sons, one of whom is here today. So that's great. Now I'm not going to sit anymore, I'm going to stand up. If I don't fall down the stairs first. All right, so unfortunately the patient advocate that I had invited to be part of the panel couldn't make it at the last minute for personal reasons. And so you're going to have to listen to me try to talk about patient-oriented research, which as a more of an IP type lawyer is a little bit tangential to what I do, but I'm going to share what I know. So what we think about with patient-oriented research is shifting the paradigm from what we usually do, which is research on people, research as people with our subjects or on their tissue samples, and convert that into research with or with patients or members of the public. So there's a few initiatives. I'm going to talk a little bit about the North American perspective because this is what I know well, but there's equal perspectives along these lines in the UK and in Europe. SPORE is the strategy for patient-oriented research in Canada, and PCORI is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute in the United States. And you can see that the shifts here are really from that on to with and by. So it involves engaging with those that have lived experience of the condition or the disease throughout the research process. So all the way from setting research and strategic priorities, through setting and designing and thinking about research questions that are of relevance to patient populations or public populations or carers or whoever is the community that you're working with, through the actual conduct of the research, the analysis of the research, the publication of the research, and the knowledge dissemination of the research. So different elements of this you can think about PORE as sort of a continuum along the research process line. And in a translational context, that takes us all the way from the bench through clinical trials through to the clinic with different health system interventions. So the other thing that patients are really helpful with is in designing health systems. So we can think about engaging with patients and publics in terms of priority setting, not just at the research end of the continuum, but also at the health system end of the continuum. So actually thinking about which of the multitude of drugs and or services we develop, we actually bring in to become part of the health system. And I'm going to touch a little bit upon that throughout the talk. So a few years ago, I was actually commissioned by the Alberta government on behalf of CIHR and the Canadian National Initiative, the SPORE Initiative, to do the bibliometric analysis of what constitutes patient-oriented research in the world. Now, it's really difficult to define out of the literature. So the government, the Alberta government, worked with a company in the US to try to develop machine learning algorithms to be able to, through abstracts and titles, define and identify patient-oriented research. And they couldn't do it. Computers aren't smart enough. They can't do everything. It takes a human eye to be able to distinguish the on and the with. So you can look at search terms around patients in a whole bunch of abstracts, but usually that research is on. So what that involved was then taking the plethora of data that was collected through the search algorithms and refining it by hand with inclusion-exclusion criteria to get down to a sample size of what we hand-codedly actually could identify as patient-oriented research. So the point to make here is that this is an area or a form of research that is increasing over time, and it's increasing at a rate that is greater than the rates of publication increase in publications database in clinical research and health services research. So it's global, it's occurring all over, but it's still dominated by research in Canada, United States, and Australia and the United Kingdom. But I think that the paradigm is kind of taking off. There's a range of different methods that engage patients or for doing patient-oriented research. So it's everything from qualitative research or doing sort of semi-structured interviews or asking patients about their experiences, all of the way through to more quantitative data through surveys, through engaging with patients in clinical trials or experimental design, through a range of different methodologies around citizens deliberation methods, through citizens juries. Anyway, there's a whole range of different methods that are used. And the aims are across that research continuum, from setting research agendas all of the way through to health systems delivery. So I'm going to talk a little bit, because I think this is the piece that's probably more at the research end that is closest to the needs and the interests of the AIR community. And it is how we can, or why we should, engage patients or those with lived experience within our data governance initiatives. So I've talked at these community meetings before, and we've gone through some of our concepts in thinking about a knowledge commons. And we've talked about the work of Lynn Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for her work on what makes for good governance of a knowledge commons that enables data use and data access and data deposit in a way that is equitable for all stakeholders. And some of the basic principles of good data governance are about active participation of the community. And that's what you're seeing here in the AIR community. It's a grassroots movement to actually come up with the standards and the tools and the governance structures. And you build trust, you build reciprocity, and you build a community that feels invested in the governance of the data structures that, for example, what Felix was talking about just before lunch. But what I'm going to argue is that it's now recognized that part of that grassroots or groundswell of movement for data governance should also involve patients. The people whose samples you're using to generate all of those sequences, that was it, 5.2 billion sequences, something like that. That's crazy numbers anyway. So, you know, how along this is the sort of a continuum of involvement from nothing to a lot. So we can think about, you know, patients being involved in not involved. We can get, you know, feedback and surveys, and I think Harriet's going to talk a little bit about how patients can be involved in setting and thinking about consent processes, for example, about how their data are used. You can have community advisory boards. You can have public representation on the governing bodies. And you can go all of the way through that. Some of these databases, like, you know, there's a repatriation of data movement out there by patients, where you actually have patient organizations running their own databases, right? And so I would say public representation, at least at the governance level for the AIR community, is probably a very good idea in terms of trust, transparency, and utility of the community resources. Okay, so with increasing patient engagement, you get trust, transparency, accountability, and representation. Okay, so this is just one more slide about how patients are interested in how their data are used. You have to be willing to do a little bit of a quid pro quo as you bring patients in to your governance structures. And one of the things that we do know, particularly with genomic data, is there's a lot of interest about genetic information and the potential health import of that information. And so if you ask people, if we find something weird about you, do you want to have that result reported back to you? And the general answer is yes. And so that tells us the kinds of processes that we need to put into place around data governance, because that will bring in what Harriet's talking about in terms of abilities to recontact and reconsent, and also return results to individuals. Okay, so I work in the clinical trial space primarily. So I've you know, co-led a gene therapy clinical trial, and so I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we've been engaging patients in clinical trials. So one of the things that we know is that most clinical trials fail. There's about 10% of small molecule drugs that get fed into the phase 1 system come out the other end as approved drugs. And if you haven't read this particular paper, the John Conley lecture in JAMA, it's one of the JAMA journals with a really complicated name that I can never pronounce, so I'll leave it with you. Head and neck, throat stuff. Journal. So thank you, Jamie. Trust the doc. Okay, so what we want to work with patients is to say, okay, we want to run a clinical trial, but instead of using surrogate endpoints or surrogate markers, we actually want to come up with clinically relevant outcomes from a patient perspective. So most of the drugs that we have been developing in the oncology space until some of the immunotherapies came online, you've got medium gains in progression-free survival of 2.1 or 2.5 months. These are not meaningful trials or endpoints for patients. And so I think bringing patients into thinking about what drugs or therapies we should be continuing through the clinical trial processes is really important. From the other perspective, it's like, what do we measure when we're doing clinical trials? So this was a clinical trial that we ran in Alberta, which was a gene therapy for a rare retinopathy, an X-linked retinopathy. And so the question is, what is a meaningful outcome for the risk of blinding or losing remaining vision in running a clinical trial that requires retinal detachment, subretinal injection, and reattachment of the retina, right? And so the patients were really expecting that gene therapy would improve their actual visual acuity. So surrogate endpoints are not good, right? We don't want surrogate endpoints. We actually want to be able to see better, or be able to see. But what happens is that you can get a real sort of therapeutic misestimation with patients that are expecting great things from a lot of hype that's out there about new and emerging technologies. So the patients were expecting the gene therapy to be regenerative, but we know that gene therapy isn't regenerative. It can rescue the cells that are mostly dead but not dead yet, but it will hold the vision loss. So moving into actually consenting the patients for these trials was really difficult because their expectation of therapeutic benefit from a phase 1 trial was very high. And so what we did was we worked with the patients to let them tell their own stories about clinical trial participation to help us inform and improve the conduct of clinical trials. So they came in with great expectations. The trial results were thanks. You're going to get your exercise today. All right. And so we enabled them to tell their own stories. We've got this submitted to a journal, but medical journals don't necessarily want to hear what patients actually think about participating in trials. And so we're having a few challenges getting it published, but I think we're finally on the right track. So, you know, just these are things that the patients would say to us. It's like, you know, I came to an appointment and I figured it was at an eye clinic and people would know what they were doing and they would guide me in through the process. But instead, they kind of waved their arms around and expected me to find the chair. Another one was I'm trying to grab a cab home, but nobody took me to the sidewalk, and I couldn't. I got injections in my one good eye, and I couldn't see the cab. You know, I had, at the end of the trial, it was very generic information that was given. I actually wanted that return of results, that return of information about me, having spent the last 2 years coming to appointments with you so that you could study me, you know, just things of common courtesy. So these are just small examples about how patients can help improve, I think, clinical trials and clinical trial results. So finally, I'm just going to finish up at the end of the poor continuum around health systems. This is something that I know is really close to near and dear to Rob's hearts, and you know, at least all of us in publicly funded health systems. There's only so much money to go around to fund healthcare, and we do not want to be developing really expensive therapies for that only the 1% can afford. We're headed that way with the immunotherapies. You know, I think a lot of the immunotherapies are much more of a process than they necessarily are a drug. But until we work out properly how to adapt those to health systems, you know, they're going to remain at a price point that is going to bankrupt health systems and limit access for patients. So drugs don't work if people can't afford them. That's my bumper sticker. So how can we engage patients? Well, there's a lot of really great methods that you can use to engage patients in resource allocation decision making in health systems or systems with finite resources. So these usually involve deliberative processes and forced choice or trade-off models. So there's a whole range of different methodologies in health economics and psychology where you can enable input from publics, from the taxpayers, and or compare and contrast that with patients or those with lived experience of the condition to actually help you define what your resource allocation should be within a health system. And those same methods can be applied to set research priorities, because remember that most publicly funded research is also taxpayer funded. So my very simple conclusion is individuals with lived experience of a disease or condition or health system are essential partners in all steps along a translational continuum from fundamental research to application in the health system. And I certainly encourage you to involve them in the governance structures of the AIR community. Thank you. Sorry, I should just thank my funders too. Okay. So Harriet, while Harriet's getting set up, I can take one question maybe. Yeah. We're down to one mic now.
Thank you, that was really interesting. Well, one thing I've observed from the fringes of a trial I wasn't involved in is that patients are not only interested in getting their own data, but in this case, we're interested in getting all the clinical trial data and having someone conduct independent evaluations from it. And that obviously raises issues in terms of confidentiality, but I think, you know, that sort of openness and availability of data is something that we should consider. And I was going to ask you one other thing though, and that is that patients, I think, would also appreciate an understanding of how things are going during the trial. And that can interfere with trial guidelines. You know, if you say this trial is going swimmingly, then that alters everybody's opinion of, you know, where they are if that's part of an outcome measure. Do you have any views on how that sort of thing can be managed?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a balance, but I think it comes with the transparency and the development of the protocol in the first place, right? And an understanding of the patients as to why you're giving them certain. Usually, a demand for things is a failure in communication. At the outset, most people are pretty reasonable if you explain that there's a purpose for a decision and not that you're just trying to hide information.